Hi, today I'd like to talk about Launchpad for literacy and particularly to talk about the applications for the EYFS. I think it's probably the best place to start, as in, well, what is it? And Launchpad is what I would call a developmental approach or a toolkit. So those are the two main ways that I would describe it, and I'll try to give a bit more detail here. It's underpinned by a skills framework, which is the main document in the approach, which plots out the skills that are involved in speech, language, and communication development. So it plots out what all the different skills are and incrementally how those develop, as well as the speech, language, and communication skills needed for spoken communication. It also includes some very, very specific skill steps that will underpin phonic readiness or underpin skills such as reading comprehension and inference as the child moves into key stage 1. So very much it is about speech and language and communication, but woven into there is a very specific focus on literacy readiness as well, things that you wouldn't normally consider if you were just looking at speech, language, and communication for functional spoken communication. It also includes other skills such as visual and fine motor skills, which funnily enough are pretty fundamental for literacy readiness. So what we're seeing here is we're not compartmentalizing literacy readiness and speech, language, and communication. We're actually bringing them together into a cohesive framework to help us consider both of those issues together. Of course, Launchpad is for all children, and that gives us an understanding of how things develop for all of our children in the EYFS. However, where the framework really comes into its own is it gives us what I would call a greater level of diagnostic capability, where we can compare a child's stage of development with what would be expected for their age. We can identify which areas of development we're seeing delays and gaps in, and we can also look for what we would call disordered developmental profile, where there are patches and gaps in the presence of higher level skills or spiky developmental profiles, and supporting documentation is provided to support that process. We are under a lot of pressure to close gaps in the EYFS and to look at trying to move children towards those age-related expectations in a very child-led and holistic way. But even so, I always think it's very difficult to think about closing or narrowing a gap, unless the process actually begins with gap identification. Where is the gap? What can the child do? What's their next step? And what is the incremental process involved in closing and narrowing this gap? As well as the framework and as well as that diagnostic capability, Launchpad comes with what I would call a toolkit of information. Understanding development is really, really crucial, but then also, okay, how do I weave that understanding? How do I weave meeting that child's next steps into my targeted curriculum, into my targeted practice? And I think that that's kind of where the toolkit element of Launchpad comes into its own. So there are supporting documents that are available on the website. It comes with kind of some handbook material, but also links for CPD videos. And that supports the process of not just understanding child development, but supports the process of embedding a developmental and gap closing approach into targeted practice. Launchpad is definitely not an isolated intervention. If anything, it's the antithesis of an isolated intervention. It's more about you understanding your children, having that specific developmental understanding, but then delivering that through targeted practice, embedding interventions into daily routines, into your interactions, into your learning environment, and into your focused activities. Saying that, Launchpad can sit neatly alongside an intervention program if you are delivering one at the minute and if you're quite happy with that. So it can sit alongside things like Blast, early talk boost, Nelly. But what Launchpad does is it complements. So it really asks us to say, well, what do I do in my targeted practice, when that group is not happening? And what do I do with the children who have got speech language concerns, who have got gaps, but who haven't been selected to go into that group? Because that group might just be a group of 6, whereas many people say they have concerns of over 50% of their cohort within the early years. And also, what am I going to do when that group finishes? Because for most of those programs, they are a time-limited journey. But just because the group has ended, the intervention program has ended, it doesn't mean that all of the gaps have gone away. Most fundamentally, some of our children who we're the most concerned about, the children who need one-to-one interactions, who cannot sit in a circle for 20 minutes and follow an adult-led agenda. Those children are causing us the most significant concerns, but they won't fit into that model of working. And Launchpad allows you to think, well, what are we going to do about those children? How are we going to address those children's needs? So it's about all of our children, and not for a limited period of time, and not for a limited period of time in your timetable. It's woven into everything. So I think it goes without saying that Launchpad ultimately can be a tool for CPD. The framework itself supports CPD. You know, it's great for getting out and rolling on the table and having team discussions, either just pure discussions about child development, or let's take some of our children and let's think about where they sit on this. What can they do? Where do we think the main gaps are? How do we think our practice meets these skills? All of that kind of fantastic, kind of very practical hands-on CPD. I think that kind of understanding, not just of speech, language and communication, but also that literacy kind of readiness understanding as well. And the skills framework has been likened to the Scarborough rope, which kind of is that graphic that looks at all those skills that are needed for literacy readiness woven together, whereas Launchpad is more about unpicking them and plotting it out with that specific detail. As well as the framework, though, the training videos and written materials ultimately support CPD, not just CPD about child development, but about, as I just mentioned before, that transference of that developmental understanding into practice. How are we going to embed intervention? How does a focus on that skill, how does that look? What does that look like within our practice? One of the applications, you know, Launchpad was developed, you know, a few years ago. But if you looked at it now, you would think that it had been written as a tool for implementing the EYFS reforms. Of course it wasn't. Launchpad was always about child development and needing to have a developmental approach in the early years. It just so happens that with the EYFS reforms, we're possibly looking for toolkits such as Launchpad to support us with this process. I think it can support you possibly in 2 ways. And of course, how it supports you is up to you. But the 2 ways that I would consider it would be to drive the detail of that curriculum, that bespoke curriculum that needs to meet the needs of your children at this moment in time, driving the detail for all children, but particularly coming into its own where children are not meeting age-related expectations. Of course, it's very obvious to see how that would link in with communication and language and also literacy, but speech, language and communication pervades all areas of learning. And so we will see cross-curricular applications for other areas of learning, and how Launchpad will support you with that too. A lot of the detail in Launchpad, particularly in relation to pragmatics, social communication, is as much about PSED as it is about communication and language. I think another fundamental role when implementing the reforms is this notion of establishing starting points. So here are my observation checkpoints. This child is not demonstrating that. Okay, So what does that mean? And what I will need to do is almost have that checkpoint as a starting point myself. And I'll need to think, right, okay, well, they can't do that, but what can they do? How far back do I have to go? And what other gaps in other areas of language might be the reason why they're not doing that? So if they're not linking 5 words together, that actually the main issue might be because their understanding is delayed, and that's affecting the number of words they can process. So of course they're not using long expressive sentences. So we it's a complex process if we really want to thoroughly look at what our children need. And supporting documentation has been written to help you with that. And fundamentally, it's about not just establishing starting points, but it's about next steps and how are we going to deliver that. One of the ways that people have been using Launchpad for quite a few years now is to do what we would call pad out phase 1. It first and foremost helps us understand what the process of literacy preparation involves and clarifies and quantifies what readiness actually is. And by doing so, it gives us what I would call the what and the why of the literacy preparation process, so that we can increasingly move away from a one-size-fits-all set of activities. People are often telling me, oh, well, we're doing phase 1, but some of the activities are too hard for our children. We keep doing them, but we just don't feel that they're getting it. And it will be because, yes, those activities work on really, really important pre-literacy skills, but the level of skill that you're working on just mismatches where the children are at the beginning. So phase 1 and the skills that phase 1 focuses on are woven into Launchpad. So it's not like, oh, we're not doing phase 1 because we're doing Launchpad. Launchpad includes phase 1 as well. But what it does is it breaks it down into much more specific and incremental detail. So say, for example, the developmental process of learning how to blend, auditory blending, is plotted out in very specific detail so that over time we can progress up those skill steps, or we can pitch at different levels depending on where different children's skills are at any moment in time. However, Launchpad also does include some skills that phase 1 just assumes and misses out. So it looks at fundamental conceptual understanding for literacy readiness. So what we find is that many children who can't hear sounds in words, it appears to be just a pure auditory discrimination issue. But actually some of those children, it's because when you say what sounds at the beginning of cat, they've got no idea what the beginning is. So they don't really know what you're asking them, never mind being able to hear the sound. And another thing we find is that many children who go on to have problems with blending actually have a deeper underpinning issue with sequential auditory memory. So say, for example, they struggle to hold 3 words in their auditory memory in the right order when we're lining up transport or lining up animals. So if they can't hold 3 words in their auditory memory in the right order, they also therefore can't hold 3 phonemes. So by working on auditory memory, really having it as part of our bespoke phase 1 means that we're going to have less children with blending issues. But at the same time, we're also going to be working on language skills for understanding, story skills, and that's really important. And of course, there's more to literacy than just phonics. So of course it includes phonic readiness, but Launchpad also includes very specific skills, very specific vocabulary skills, for example, that will underpin reading comprehension and skills such as inference and prediction that children will need to pull out of the bag in Key Stage 1. And we're going to kind of have a bit of a focus on those and make sure that we prepare the ground in the early years. And also creating that really firm language base for writing. We've talked about phase 1 and preparation. So obviously in reception, those activities and those kind of skills are still going to need to be delivered through child initiated, through our learning environment, through woven into other areas of the curriculum alongside our SSP. So that stands true for reception too. However, we all know in reception that there will be a child or a few children in September when they walk through your door, whether they've come through your nursery or whether they've been fed to you by somebody else, where you think, oh my goodness me, that child's not ready. And probably you are right, as in they're not ready for phonics. But what we need to do is we need to clarify and quantify what that not ready means for that individual child. Which skills are they not ready with? Are they not ready with all of the pre-phonic skills? Or are they ready with some but not others? And how not ready are they? Are they just a little bit not ready? Or do I have to go really far back before I find out what the child can do? But also, what can they do and what do they need to do next? So alongside my SSP, I can begin to weave in really, really bespoke opportunities for those children so that I am specifically targeting their barriers and removing them by closing that gap. As well as those children who are very obviously not ready, I will also have some children who have got what I would call hidden gaps. Those children who in the first few weeks, I think that they're ready, but it becomes quite apparent that learning is problematic for them in this area. Launchpad allows us to stop the bus and kind of say, why might that be? What is the issue? What is the developmental issue? Of course, it's important that you teach SSP consistently and well, but at the same time, we have to identify those speech, language and communication and other developmental barriers, which are the reasons why the child is not responding to that consistent and strong teaching. And through the year, we'll have issues. Oh gosh, I've got a child who knows lots of letters, but they're not moving into blending. Why might that be? Is it a sequential auditory memory issue? Is it an auditory blending issue? What are we going to do about it? So it's that kind of let's identify the barriers and do something about it alongside that SSP approach that everybody says is so important at the moment. It goes without saying, I think, and I think it's already been inferred that this has lots of applications for children with speech, language and communication needs, and those children with more specific and significant difficulties. Before we talk about children who are known to other services and outside agencies, I think it's important to say that some of our children will have speech and language and communication gaps, but they won't warrant referrals to outside agencies because their gaps are not significant enough. Or it might be that if we do put in a referral, that child just gets discharged straight away because they haven't met what we would call clinical thresholds. So for children with speech and language and communication needs, I'm going to come to those who are known to speech and language therapy in a minute. But for those children who might not warrant referrals or who don't meet clinical thresholds, it gives us the ability to look at that child's development ourselves, to diagnose gaps, to set next steps, and to do what I would call deal with this issue in-house, but to also have a greater sense of knowing where you're going and being able to kind of ensure that that child makes progress. Of course, it kind of looks at speech, language and development, but also pre-literacy. But the fact that it's got visual skills in there is really interesting when it comes to speech, language and communication and SEND needs, because it allows us to look at does the child's speech, language and communication skills correlate with their visual skills? Is there a difference between very early developmental indicators of verbal intelligence and non-verbal intelligence? Am I seeing what I would call spiky developmental profiles, which might be one of the ways that we identify very specific needs, or certain patterns would indicate things like developmental language disorder. So there's supporting documentation to support you with these things as well, but it allows us to really look at those children more closely. And the important thing is it's about identifying those children early and really starting that process of embedding targeted interventions straight away, rather than necessarily waiting for a number of weeks or a number of months until they're seen by somebody else. Of course, we need to then take that kind of professional's opinion into consideration. Of course we do, but we still need that sense of, whilst we're waiting, we kind of think that we're on the right lines and that we know that we're doing the right thing by this child. And as I've said many, many times, the focus is on embedding interventions into interactions, into your daily routines, into your learning environment, and into your focus planning. Where we do work with outside agencies, where a child is known to somebody else, Launchpad for Literacy supports those referrals and discussions that we might have, because it gives us that kind of specific detail and language to support how we describe what a child can do and what we feel the child finds tricky and what the child's needs are. It can be a cohesive framework for outside agencies to discuss and feedback about a child. So I know speech and language therapists who actually will use the framework to actually talk about what they found with the child, what they feel the child can do, where they feel the child's gaps are, but also what's the priority gap that needs to be dealt with before the other gaps. And that's a really useful application. And when that outside person, that outside professional, that outside agency gives targets, if I know where those targets correlate on the Launchpad for Literacy Skills framework, it becomes much easier for me to think, how am I going to embed that into my practice? Where does that fit in with my curriculum, so that I'm increasingly seeing what I need to do with that child as an isolated intervention pack, delivering isolated targets, or going through an isolated pack of activities that have been given to me for a specific child. And of course, within all of this, those internal processes such as EHCP applications, Launchpad can support that. This is what we've found, this is the targeted approach we've implemented, and over this period of time, the child has made some progress, but not as much progress as we would be expecting. And also the writing of PEPs, what is the main area of development that you're targeting? What are the children's next steps? How are you delivering those next steps and meeting this child's needs? And I think that's kind of pretty much a summary of Launchpad in the EYFS. If you want to know more, obviously just get in touch with me. My email was at the beginning of the presentation, but also there are some links here. The first couple of links are things that are outside of Launchpad. So there's some language enrichment training there that can be for anybody, whether you've got Launchpad or not. And in the same vein, the podcast that I did with the Early Years Foundation Stage Forum team is there, where we discuss speech and language delay disorder, but also the importance of understanding that in relation to the EYFS reforms. And then the last two links are for kind of more specific information about Launchpad, some case studies on the website, and also a link, if you're interested, to watch a video where I discuss Launchpad with the amazing Anne Brass from Durham local authority, just to give you a bit more idea about the ethos and the background, and also what she feels the applications are. Thank you for your time.